Hey, what's up, guys? I'm Brian Altano. I'm here with Zach Stein.
Hey there.
And Jose Otero.
What's going on?
We're going live via Google Hangout to Lucy O'Brien, who reviewed The Evil Within for IGN.
Hey guys, it's good to be here. Yes, I reviewed The Evil Within. Here is a quick recap of the verdict. The Evil Within is a brutal, challenging, and remarkably fun game. Its eerie world and imaginative enemies are genuinely frightening, and the scares are heightened significantly by the scarcity of resources at your disposal.
Out of ammo.
It keeps the odds stacked against you to the point that they often feel insurmountable, yet it's finely tuned to the point that they never really are, as long as you can keep a cool head and a steady aim in the face of building panic. While its story does end up buckling under its own ambition, there is little here that takes away from the joy of experiencing survival horror under the steady hand of a master of the craft. All right, guys. So that was what I thought of the game. I really loved it, to sort of put it lightly. I thought it was great fun. I thought it was terrifying. Now I think, this is an old school horror game, and horror games to some extent have moved on in terms of pacing, in terms of sort of character development and stuff like that. But I am very interested to see. I found it scary. Did you guys find it scary?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very intense experience, and you find that you need to breathe every once in a while. You're gripping the controller tightly and worried about your safety every moment of the game.
Yeah, I think that it does an incredible job of building tension, just sort of atmospherically. It's got some of the best sound design I've heard in a game in a long time, and I think it's sort of this mix between the sort of tangible enemies you fight in a Resident Evil game, and then the supernatural enemies that you see in some of the more like recent horror games with ghosts and stuff like that, where like something will come into the room and you'll be like, how do I fight this with the sort of weapons that I have here? And you have to kind of work from it from there.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, that question, actually, because I, flipping between this and like Alien Isolation, I feel like Alien was sort of a scarier game because I feel so vulnerable all the time. Like whenever I'm trying to like travel within this space station, I feel like every time I'm out of cover, I'm terrified. Whereas in The Evil Within, I feel like there's just a natural tension that builds. I think you hit it on the head, where it is sort of an old school survival horror game, but it's kind of got the new school look going on at the same time, which is an interesting approach. That said, I do feel that it has genuine moments of tension, but I also feel like some of it comes across a little wacky at times, and that might just be a cultural thing, looking at like, okay, written, and sort of directed in Japan, and sort of their approach to horror is a little different from ours. But overall, I would agree with you that it is a scary game.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of people ask me, because obviously they were released so close together, which game should I get? Should I get Alien Isolation or should I get The Evil Within? And, I would say that in terms of the way that they scare you, they both do it very differently. I think The Evil Within, it as you said, Jose, it does build tension really well, but I always found I could escape from a situation. Even if I died over and over again, I always felt eventually if I just did it right, I would be able to get out of the situation. With Alien, it's very much a horror simulator. It's all about hiding. It's all about like shutting yourself in a locker and trying to escape, because if you get caught, then you're dead. With The Evil Within, even though you're a little underpowered, you still have enough at your disposal to be able to fight or to flee, right?
Yeah, I definitely give a lot of credit to the director, Shinji Mikami, because I think he's really good at pulling the rug out from under you, and I feel like that's something that The Evil Within does really well.
Yeah.
And so that kind of adds to sort of the scary atmosphere, because there are moments where you're revisiting like the place to upgrade. And there are times where like the camera is doing something completely different when you got there, or you spawned in a completely different area of that facility. Like you have certain expectations when you go through the portal, and yet it's unfolding completely differently. And I think that that's one of its strengths, and that's how it leans on scares versus, like you said, with Alien.
Sure.
There's a lot more atmosphere. I haven't played Alien Isolation, but the atmosphere in The Evil Within it's just a texture of unease, and it builds over time. And though you do have the weapons, right, and you can fight versus Alien Isolation, where you can't really fight the monster. You can fight these monsters, you can fight these creatures, but you never quite feel like you're on even footing. It's going to take some cunning, it's going to take some planning. And you don't always, you never quite have enough ammunition, you never quite have enough health, and you're always managing. And I think that's what it does to you, is it makes you feel uneasy throughout the game. You never feel like Lucy said in a review that you're on uneven footing.
Yeah, I always felt like the main underlying threat in The Evil Within was sort of perception. And it was the way that you could walk into a room and be like, I think I understand what's going on in here. And then all of that would evaporate. You know, quite literally environments change in front of you in that game. Like it is very psychological in a lot of ways. And I think in Alien, you sort of, you're like, this is my threat. There's any number of ways it can kill me, but I sort of have an understanding of what this is. Whereas these supernatural elements that come into play in The Evil Within make you question turning down a hallway. Like even the safest areas seem like they could evaporate at a moment and turn into something that can kill you.
Yeah, and they both sort of play with very familiar perspectives if you think about it. I mean, the third-person action game these days is like very synonymous. Like it's something we're all used to, that sort of camera angle, that presentation. The first-person shooter is something that we're also very used to, I feel. But both games come at it so differently, and in a way that I agree with everyone so far in terms of how, you know, playing with perception, playing with expectation, and sort of in Alien, that's that visible threat and knowing, oh man, it's in the next room. Where the heck am I going to hide right now?
Yeah.
Now, I realize that survival horror isn't for everyone, and a lot of the complaints I've heard about the game are due to the fact that you are unpowered, but almost unfairly so. I mean, for example, protagonist Sebastian can only hold 4 matches, which makes no sense. He's incredibly unfit. And, you know, the monsters in the game are often way more agile than you are. Now, even though it made little sense, I kind of loved it. I just kind of went with it. But I'm curious to hear what you guys thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's just part of the game. And these are the tropes that come with this style of game. But if that wasn't there, I don't think it would be the same game that we played. I mean, yeah, you only have a certain amount of ammunition. You can only run for about 4 or 5 seconds or whatever it is before you're out of breath. I mean, it's all preposterous, but at the same time, you just let it go because that's just the mechanic of the game, and it still makes it fun. If you're going to start looking for realism, you're going down a rabbit hole there, you know, at that point.
Yeah, and to be fair, I'm totally out of breath after 5 seconds of running too. So that's completely realistic to me. But yeah, I thought it did. I think a lot of people have a different understanding of what survival horror means to them, and most people, if you ask them what the definition of that is, they sort of just hover back to the original Resident Evil, and that's not how you create a definition. That's just an example. That's one game. I think that adding stuff like running out of breath, the matches thing, inventory management to an extent, I think is important. And I think that's sort of what defines the genre. And over the years, it's sort of become about more how long can you hide inside of a locker. To me, that might be scary and there might be tension there, but I don't know if you can prolong an experience like that over something the length of Evil Within, you know, which is, you know, over a dozen hours.
And if you're going to look at something like this, I mean, a mental hospital that leaves matches and ammunition around, I mean, what kind of place was this, right?
Yeah.
So
that's a good point.
There you go.
I feel like The Evil Within is definitely born from a director that has seen it all in survival horror, if you think about it, right? Like Mikami was the director on the original Resident Evil. He was then also the director on Resident Evil 4, which are 2 very different examples of the survival horror game, where one, it was about limitations and resources and not having many of them, and every time you wasted them, the stress that came with that. And then the other one was more about the action element and just pure survival, like being put in tense situations where everything is being thrown at you at once. And I feel that The Evil Within is just trying to kind of marry the two, and I guess he said as much. It's true that some of it feels ridiculous, right? Like the idea that this guy can barely run a few seconds, even if that's also true of Brian. But he looks physically fit, and he looks like, you know, in that world, it just shouldn't be. But I feel that limitations in horror games are ultimately what make them a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
Because you are constantly, you know, fearful of, man, I've got 3 bullets in this thing, and there are like 4 of them right now. Like, what am I going to do? And that's the puzzle to be solved. It's sort of like, how do I approach this? How do I get through this section without ultimately getting my head cut off?
Exactly.
Totally. And, I found some of the most, like, thrilling parts of The Evil Within for me were those moments where I just managed to escape a situation by the skin of my teeth. Yeah. You know, where I sort of like, I mentioned it in the review, but there was this one boss battle where it was a close combat boss, and all I had were 3 or 4 like sniper rifle bullets, and that was it. And it was just it was a joke. Yeah, I mean, it was actually a joke of a situation, but in the end, I managed to kill him, and it was such a thrill. And that's part of the reason why I love this style of game.
Yeah, you're definitely throwing your arms up in an exclamation when you took them down with only 4 sniper bullets, or you were able to survive something like that. And I think that's something that this game does really well. I mean, it takes a lot of things that you may have even seen in previous Resident Evils, right? Like we've seen the Chainsaw Man, or we've seen the unstoppable force of this enemy that can kill you. But Evil Within just from the beginning approaches that very differently, right? And even though it's a bit scripted and some of the stuff surviving by the skin of your teeth, it's either something as tense as what you just said, where it like came down to the resources you had, or others are a little more scripted in that it was just a close call because of a cutscene.
Yeah.
But regardless, it's thrilling and it's interesting.
Yeah, the Evil Within feels a lot to me like this sequel to Resident Evil 4 that I never really thought we'd get. I mean, we got Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6, and to some extent 5 sort of touched on some of what made the games before it so great. But I think there was a lot of stuff in 5 with, you know, machine guns and overpowered weapons and 2 characters, and you almost, it felt like a huge action game with some survival horror elements, whereas I feel like Resident Evil 4 walked that line perfectly. Evil Within, I think, what? You're mad?
No, I would push back on that a little and say that by the end, RE4 slipped into that problem.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like
Oh, it did. It did.
3/4 of the game, they absolutely nailed the survival tone. And then by the end, you got guys with machine guns and weirdness.
Sure,
like
but
that.
in the Evil Within, I mean, I did what Lucy did, which is I was on a boss fight and I fired every bullet I had from my handgun, and then I was out. And then I said, oh man, I got to move on to my shotgun. I'm like, I only have 2 shells in my shotgun. Fired both of those. Then I'm like, I have my crossbow. There's 1 bolt left in here. I can make another one, but I don't have enough time. And then there's my sniper rifle. So you're left with just a few items, and you're sort of forced to create situations out of them where you can make the best out of all of them.
Of course.
And to me, that's sort of what old school survival horror means to me, is sort of that inventory management, that terror that comes from being like, something's going to kill me. It's way more powerful than everything I have, but I have to use the very scraps I have left to bring it down before it kills me.
It's an environmental puzzle in a way, right?
Yeah.
It's like you need to figure out what order you use these resources, when to use them, how to use them. And when you do that, the sense of accomplishment, you know, the achievement, you feel like, yeah, I mean, you earn those moments. And I think it was brilliantly orchestrated for this game.
Now, listen, I just want to have a quick chat about my major criticism of The Evil Within, which was, and you know, to be fair, I didn't have too many, but which was the story itself and the character of Sebastian, who's your player character. I felt that the story was a little all over the show, and B, I felt that Sebastian himself was probably the best term to describe it is lifeless. And I felt that both those things kind of let an otherwise really excellent game down. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I heard your criticism on that, and as I started playing the game, I realized maybe there's a subtle brilliance to this, that they're giving you this blank canvas for you to put your own feelings and expectations on this person. Maybe if he had a stronger personality, you wouldn't be as sucked in, where he's more of a passive person as far as his comments and what's happening. And through that, you are a part of this game. That was just maybe my take on it. I don't know if that's what their thoughts were, but...
a building's falling over. He's just Captain Chill. He's like,
right.
oh, sure.
Well, that's
whatever.
interesting.
See, I'm sort of torn because the most realistic horror movies or horror games ever would involve a major character of some importance dying in the first 5 minutes, and then the main character sitting in a corner and crying for years. But in The Evil Within, you have a character that's basically just like, oh man, that was weird, and he keeps walking into the next room. So I do think he was wooden, but I do think it's also sort of nearly impossible to convey what somebody like that could even remotely be going through mentally to sustain that amount of punishment that he's receiving throughout that game. So it's a thin line to walk. I would have liked to see a little more personality from him, a little more characterization. I had some problems with some of the supporting characters. I felt that they'd get into sort of horror movie tropes at times. Yeah. But I think that all in all, it sort of comes together. It's sort of this puppet show that's used as to convey what's actually happening in the backdrop, which is where most of the story is really taking place.
Yeah, I do agree that sort of the story and the tone sort of suffers from what I kind of attribute to it. It almost feels like late 90s voice acting and late 90s story, or even early 2000, 2004, whatever Resident Evil 4's time period is. I feel like a lot of it is very Leon Kennedy's almost personality, but a lot less cool, or just kind of strange. And I almost wonder if that's just for cultural differences. You know, obviously this game was made in Japan. It was made by a Japanese team who, this is sort of their vision of some of the gross out horror, which you take it or leave it, right? Like it's definitely a part of that game. But it's also that I almost wonder if it's not cool for the hero to react on that front. Like maybe that's why. Maybe it's just sort of some cultural divide. Because we've seen it before in other survival horror games, I feel, out of Japan too. And I'm not blaming them for that. I think it does have its own charm, and I think it does have its own sort of appeal.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do find it ridiculous when there are certain scenes. Like there's one where you run into the patient, Leslie, and he's like, "We're losing our minds, losing our minds."
Right,
It just echoes for a few seconds, and it's just so like late 90s voice acting to me, and so bizarre. And it never feels, I mean, I'm sure the story later kind of picks up what he's talking about, but it just doesn't play very well for me, like as someone in the West who's sort of looking to be intrigued and thrilled by a survival horror game.
See,
well, what's interesting about that is that, you know, I thought it was going to be, I don't want to spoil anything, but I thought that there was really going to be a strong justification for this kind of stilted, you know, back and forth. And because there are moments where it's kind of like really quite endearing. There are moments where it reminded me of like some of the kind of driest moments in Twin Peaks, like just these people just kind of emoting in the weirdest way. But yeah, unfortunately for me, it didn't quite pay off in the way that I wanted it to. Yeah. But I don't want to get too much into the ending.
No, I actually really like that word, endearing. I think it says a lot to what this game is. Like I feel like if this game was a movie, it would have been shot on a small budget, and all the special effects would have been practical. There would have been a guy at the end of a tunnel with a big hose shooting blood everywhere, and the characters would have been. There's something sort of cheap about it that kind of works for me as like an old school horror fan. But I think that like as a video game, as beautiful as it is, like some of the other video game elements don't really hold up. It's almost as if it was made in a vacuum that like only Resident Evil games were made in, and this is the follow-up to them, rather than let's look at the way video games have progressed.
Yeah, but it does have really like forward-thinking ideas too, right? Like think about, you know, we talked about it in a prior video, but how they kind of play with your expectations, how they kind of play with the camera all of a sudden, how all of a sudden it's black and white, grain film, and you're just like, what is happening right now? And I think that's when sort of the presentation is at its best.
Yes.
It's just a shame that the story doesn't always catch up to where the risk the presentation takes, I feel.
Yeah, I think there's a grindhouse feel they're going with the grainy film and the jump cuts and some of the weirdness in the images there. And I think the cheapness may have been on purpose in a way. I mean, I can see it, that they were going for this sort of stilted wooden texture again. I'll go back to this feel of just that adds unease to it.
Yeah.
I think that adds to the overall flavor, and his behavior, absolutely could be part of that as well. I like Lucy's Twin Peaks theory. I really have to look at it from that point, but I love Leslie because that would be me if I were in this game.
Yeah, and if anything, it kind of adds to the layers of confusion, which I feel that's effective for like really like messing with the audience, right?
Yeah.
I also love playing a video game where after I'd finished it, I was like, no one else could have made that game apart from Shinji Mikami. And I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to say of a big budget video game these days. I mean, it was so characteristic of him.
Yeah, no, he's definitely a master at this was mentioned in another video also, just like pulling the rug out from under you. He's really good at that, and he definitely knows how to throw a curveball when you're expecting something else.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I can't help but admire this game.
Yeah, I think it's kind of cool to have that sort of calling card feel when you finish a game like that, or even when you're playing it. Because when you're watching a movie, you can be like, man, that is a Tarantino movie.
Yes.
Like that's what that feels like. This is what the aesthetic feels like. This is the music cues and everything. These are the way the characters are written. And I think that I'd like to see video games get to be like that a little bit more, where you can sort of see a director taking hold of his work and building a theme across the entire game, and then across his entire career.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
It's an auteur.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot. For more on The Evil Within, stick with IGN.